tonight's. Anybody go home and noodle a little more over the idea of status and power? Anybody go to work and go, oh, I think I have some status and power here that I didn't know? Anybody experience that a little bit? No? Yes? Yes. Mm. So they exerted their status and power. Wow. Wow. So that was a little rough. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. When it's misused, it's not pretty. Power in itself, by the way, is not a negative concept. God actually created the world with power, right? Through power. Power in itself is not bad. We tend to think that power is coercive. But power was intended in the garden, in the creation of the world, to be used for good, for flourishing. Unfortunately, it always can be used separately. Yes. Oh, we're ready. What was going on? Oh, hi, people on Facebook Live. I actually just asked the women here what they had thought about last week's lesson. Did they noodle over the idea of power and status? When they went to work, did they sense, oh, wait, I do have some status, I do have some power? And one of the women in the room said, well, actually, her boss exerted his or her power and authority and status over her by cussing her out. And that's when I picked up and said, yes, unfortunately, power is in and of itself God's intention to be used good in the creation. He used it to bring flourishment to all of creation, but people use power and status in sinful ways, including us at times. So, kind of an interesting. One of the fun things to think about is the idea that as women in this room, we have status because of why? Like, what are some of the things that give us status? Education, socioeconomic status. And how do we know that we're higher status by being in this room in general? Bingo! You can pay for wine. That's exactly right. So that tells you status right there, right? What about the fact that I am white? Does that give me status over people who are not white? Yes. We're having a man come in the room. Does his manness give him status over me being female? Yes, right? So there are lots of things that give us status, right? As American women, right? It can be color, it can be socioeconomic, it can be education, it can be family. Like, for example, Bill Gates' son, I don't know anything about him, but he could be tremendously mediocre in life. But he has what we call ascribed status, privileges, right? He was born into them. Some things are acquired, like education, and some things are just you're born into it. You lucked out by who your parents were or the fact that you were even born in a particular place. Like, I'm lucky, or not lucky, but I'm blessed to be born in the United States versus some tribal places in South Sudan who believe women are property today. Right? You do know there's other countries that still say, okay. So Bill Gates' son could be, very much mediocre, but the truth is, because he's Bill Gates' son, he's going to have ascribed status. He's going to get to go to Harvard, even if he's stupid, isn't he? And I am not going to get that status, am I? So, anyway, it's just fun to think about that. What kind of status do we have in power, and how do we use it like Jesus would use it? That's where we were last week, and that's we are now in the third week of 5-week series talking about 5 women in the scripture, and they are going to talk to us about power and vulnerability and leadership. And tonight we're talking about Tamar, who was a woman in the nation of Israel. We're back in the Old Testament. Remember, we started with Old Testament, moved to New Testament. Now we're back in Old Testament. She's a woman in Israel who is vulnerable and dependent on others doing right by her. And for those who have the power and authority to act justly when someone doesn't do right by her. Okay? So she is a woman who is vulnerable in the nation of Israel. And we're going to talk about why she was vulnerable. And you had some of that in your lesson. She's vulnerable, which means she's dependent on others to do right by her, to be righteous. And when someone isn't doing right by her, when they aren't righteous, then she is dependent on those who can bring justice to do so for those who have not done right by her. Now, why do I keep accentuating righteousness and justice? Because that's kind of what we're talking a little bit about tonight. Vulnerability, and then what happens when those who have the power and authority to act rightly don't, and then those that have the power and authority to act justly don't. Righteousness and justice in the scriptures they're very similar. They kind of go together. They're like the heads and tail of a coin. They're related. They're kind of wed, if you will. Righteousness means to be fair, fairness, generosity, equity, and actually justice also means equity. So there's some different nuances between the two words, but they kind of dance together. Righteousness means that you are in right relationship with others. Okay, so righteousness and the word justice is always tied around relationships, that you have right relationships as God intended them to be. That's what righteousness means. We tend to think of it as purity, right? Like I morally do right or wrong. But actually, the biblical text doesn't tend to deal with it as much about purity as we do. It's more about how you're related rightly with each other according to how God has established relationships. It means to do the right thing in terms of the people we live with. And righteous actions lead to shalom. That's a Hebrew word that means wholeness, peace. Hey, how are you? It's so good to see you. Come in, come in. I know I'm pointing you out, and that was awful. So sorry. So it's shalom means wholeness. It's what God intended in the garden. It's what we see in relationships in the garden. We have watched over this past year and a half a wave of courageous women come forward and share story after story of unrightness that has been done to them, right? Where there has been unrighteousness. Unrightness has been done to them by another person, right? This is why we have the Me Too, the Church Too movement. Powerful men inside and outside the church have been accused of sexually exploiting and abusing women. And that is not how God intended for relationships to be. It's unrighteous. And what we are listening to over the last year and a half is a group of women demanding justice happen in light of the fact that unrightness has been done to them. So this story couldn't be more appropriate in American history than right now. Unrighteousness demands justice. Justice, or mishpat, is about making things right. It's an action word. So it means and includes just punishment, which is what we tend to think about justice, is that it's just punishment for wrongdoing, and that is part of what it means to be just or to apply justice. But it also means giving people their rights that are due to them. So justice has kind of two sides to it. The idea of delivering punishment, just punishment, but also the idea of giving someone their rights, right? Giving people their rights. It's giving people what they're due, whether it's punishment, protection, or care. Justice has that wrapped in it. Someone needs justice because someone else is not living righteously. Now, all of this is going to come together when we talk about what happened to Tamar. In the Old Testament, every time you see the word mishpat, it usually includes several classes of people. They're continually come up whenever the word justice is used. And those classes of people tend to be the poor, widow, and the orphan, those that are vulnerable in that society. God always ties them together. Like, for example, Zechariah 7:10-11. This is what the Lord Almighty says. This is what the verse says. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless or the immigrant or the poor. The reason God put these people alongside that word justice is because they were the most vulnerable in antiquity. They had no social power. And that's why he says we've got to bring justice for those who have no social power. Which brings us to Tamar. She has absolutely no social power. She has no agency. Now, when I use that word, I know a lot of you are going, I know that in a sentence, but I don't really know the definition. I can't remember if the lesson I made you chase that word down. Did I do that, Linda? Yes? Yes? Okay. So I made you chase it. What did you learn for those of you who did it? And by the way, if you didn't, I don't care. It's okay. Like, you're not going to get graded here. Um, what did you learn about agency? That because sometimes looking at the definition, you're like, oh, what did you find? Great. Someone who has agency can act in their own power and they are free to make their own choices. Yep. Anybody else want to add to that? Hey, Steve, I can't see this. Could you come make sure I'm on this? Sorry, I don't know how it shows up here. I have something, but it's not showing up. Hi. Okay. What other word would you give with agency? What other thing did you find? And maybe that summarizes it. Anybody else want to add? All right, we'll sit with that. Okay, so she has no social power and she has no agency, the capacity to act independently or to make her own free choices. And you saw that in the lesson. Thank you. You saw that in the lesson, right? It made you chase some of the laws in the Mishnah that talk about women in the nation of Israel. And remember about this last week also. And the reason I'm doing this is so that we can be sure to know the context of this woman's story. What were her rights? What weren't her rights? Because her context doesn't look anything like our context, does it? We have agency in the United States. We may not have the full fleshing out of that agency, but we have rights on the book, and that is the beginning to something. Okay. So Tamar has no agency. She has no social power, so therefore she's extremely vulnerable. She is dependent on others to do right and bring justice when people don't do right. Tonight we're going to dig into her story, and as we do, we are going to hear a serious warning. It's like God is shooting a bow over the bow and saying, "Take note, church. Take note of the warning that comes from the Lord." Because he's going to warn those who have social power, those who have agency, about ignoring the abuse of those who don't. And that's really what we're going to walk away with tonight, is a warning to the church. And we are, by the way, the church. We're a part of the church. So her story opens up in the Bible in 2 Samuel 13, which is in the Old Testament. And before I get started, I need to acknowledge that whenever I walk alongside a group of women this size, that in this room, there are women who have experienced what we're going to talk about in Tamar's story tonight. And I'm aware of that. Sorry. I know that many of you have suffered abuses in different ways. Some of it has been sexual, some of it hasn't. Some of it has been rape. And I know that steals something from us that takes a whole long time to recover from. So I want to be sensitive while I walk through the story. I know that this can trigger some people. I actually called some of my counselor friends before I walked into this story and said, what do I need to do? Which is why I got a resource list put together, because I am not a professional when it comes to healing trauma healing, but I do know people who are. And so I'm going to bring up this subject. It may trigger some, and if it does, let me know. Go to the resource page. Let's get you where you need to go, and that goes for women who are watching on Facebook Live too. It is posted on Facebook Live. And if you have other resources that we may not be aware of, hey, post them so that we can benefit from one another. This is a tough topic, subject. I don't want to sweep it under the rug because I don't think God does. I know our families have. I know when we have told our parents, they have said, let's just put behind us. I know I pastored you. I know that churches have asked us to sweep it under the rug. I know I have pastored you. But God does not sweep this subject underneath the rug. Here it is in the scripture. He speaks to us through the rape of a woman's story, and he's speaking to us individually right now, and I think collectively, historically in America right now. So we're going to start in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. And I'm reading from different translations because I grab them from different translations. So you can just listen along, open up there if you want. In the course of time, Amnon, the son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. And Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, take note, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now, take note of what he's frustrated with. He's frustrated that she's a virgin. And in that culture, a virgin is protected property. Not person, but protected property. Right? We saw this when you went through the laws in the Mishnah. If a daughter who's a virgin is violated sexually, she is treated like property, and it is her father who owns the property that is compensated, right? So she is protected property. And she is protected not only by her father, but also by her brother. This is why Absalom is named first in the text. He is the older brother, and he is obviously the one that is in care for protecting her also. Amnon is a half-brother. So in verse 6, we have Amnon pretends to be sick so he can get his father, King David, to come to him. Now, this is interesting to me, too. You notice he doesn't ask Absalom, the closest brother to her, to come. He goes for David. Somehow he knows David is a little easier to flip than the brother. So he invites his father, right? And he doesn't, and then it says he's trying to get Absalom. Absalom's the brother that's going to protect her. So he's trying to get him out of the way. Verse 6 and 7. When the king came to him to see him, Amnon said to him, I would like my sister so I may eat from her hand. And David sent word to Tamar at the palace. Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him. So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon. So he figures out how to get around the older brother. And in verse 12 and 14, Amnon grabs Tamar. And she pleads with him during this moment. She recognizes he's about to rape her, and she uses wisdom. She starts like trying to bargain with him to avert this disaster that's about to happen to her. And she even mentions in the text to him, right? This will be a shame upon him too. So she offers a solution. Hey, look, if you're going to do this, like go ask Dad, King David, permission to marry me. So she offers a solution. I want you to think about this. This woman is about to be raped. And in the process, she starts debating and trying to figure out how to spare herself, mostly, and even Amnon from disgrace. You did some reading about the Jewish women at that time, and you know she lacked power and agency, so she pleads for her survival. Because in her culture, her worth is what? We talked last week. A woman's worth in Judaism was based on three things. Children, but does it? A son, a husband, and being sexually pure for the honor of her husband, right? So she can have kids, and she can have a daughter, and that might be okay, but sooner or later she better pop out a boy, or there's problems, right? So her worth, her whole identity is based on the fact that she will marry, and that she will give birth to a son, and that she will be a reputable wife that honors her husband. She's a virgin. To be viable for a good marriage, to socially marry up, you got to be a virgin. And it's about to be taken from her. Her whole world is crashing down. She's going to be shamed, dishonored, desolated, and so she pleads. And in verse 14, he ignores her plea and he rapes her. Now, let me pause and say this about rape. Most victims are raped by people they know. Most victims are raped by people they know. Rape is easier to commit in situations where the aggressor has the advantage of structural domination. Let me say that again. Rape is easier to commit in situations where the aggressor has the advantage of structural domination. So, Harvey Weinstein, does he have the advantage of structural dominance in his world? Yes, he does. How about Larry Nassar, the U.S. Olympics doctor? Did he have the advantage of structural domination? Yes, he did. What about Bill Cosby? Did he have structural? I mean, I could go down the list. Notice I'm not even mentioning some of the men that have fallen from the church in the last year. So rapes are easier to commit in situations where the aggressor has the advantage of structural domination. Most rapes are planned. This goes to disprove the theory that a rapist is usually provoked by some woman's flimsy clothing that she wore to the bar. It is not that he is overcome by some physical urge. Most rapes are planned. Rape has nothing to do with sex. Rape has nothing to do with sexual gratification. Sexual violence is simply the imposition of domination and authority and humiliation and sometimes annihilation of someone who cannot retaliate. We need to have an accurate understanding about what rape is. Amnon raped Tamar, and then he loathed her, and he wanted to dispose of her. He doesn't even use her name when he addresses that he wants her sent out. He treats her like a disposable object. He says in verse 15, "Arise and be gone." Doesn't even address her name. He treats her like a disposable object. Throw this out, is how Eugene Peterson might say it in the Message. He's not with us anymore. He's now with Jesus. But he might say, throw this out. She pleads again in verse 16. "No, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you have done for me." Now watch what she's doing. She's actually saying, you have been unrighteous toward me. You have not treated me rightly as God intended. Now I'm asking for justice. Act, right? Do what will make this right. The punishment or what's due to me. That's what she's asking, right? Either the punishment for what you've just done that's unrighteous or what's due to me. Give me my rights. Well, what's her right in the scripture? Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29. You read it in your lesson. I'll read it to you. "If a man meets a virgin who is not engaged and seizes her and lies with her, and they are caught in the act, the man who lay with her shall give 50 shekels of silver to the young woman's father." How would you like that? 50 shekels. I'm like, dude, I'm worth way more than that. "And she shall become his wife. Because he violated her, he shall not be permitted to divorce her or send her away as long as he lives." This is now what's due to her, justice. So he asks, be righteous. And he blows right past that. Do justice. Give me what's due to me. You must at least marry me. This seems so, out there, doesn't it? This doesn't happen today, does it? Except actually it does. I was teaching in East Texas, at a megachurch. And I was teaching on this idea of, I won't go into it, but basically gender stuff around women. Had a woman from the Philippines come up to me afterwards with her husband. And she shared with me her story. She said, "Thank you for saying some things from the pulpit that I've never heard said." She said, "I grew up in the Philippines underneath a Christian home, godly parents, went to Bible college. My family had man come over to visit when I was home from Bible college, 71-year-old man, and he raped me. And I didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to handle it. This was very foreign to her. Um, Not just the rape, but just how do you, she's in a culture where there's a tremendous amount of honor and shame. She didn't even realize it, but months in, discovered she was pregnant. So she called him to tell him she's pregnant, and he said, well, you must marry me then. It's the only way to keep honor them in this culture. So she does. She quits school and marries this very old man and gives birth to this daughter that was birthed from rape. Her parents died on their deathbed never knowing why she dropped out of Bible college and married this old man. They had better aspirations for her. They spent their whole life disappointed in her. Like she had chosen to give up her life and they couldn't figure out why. I asked her, why didn't you ever just tell your parents? She goes, oh, they could have never handled that. I needed to give them honor. The man she was with was her second husband. She stayed with that man until he passed, and then she remarried and came to the United States. So yeah, this is an ancient story. But there I was in East Texas hearing this story. It happened, and it happens. She asks for justice, and he ignores her and throws her out. Verse 19. Tamar puts ashes on her head and tore the long robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went on her way, wailing as she went. Now, what we have here is a woman who is expressing that she is in mourning. And she has ripped her clothes. She's a virgin. In that culture, you don't show your hands. You don't, right? Like if you get to see the rip of a woman, it's a little sensual. She is ripping her clothes. What is she saying without saying what's happened? What is she saying to the people who are watching her walk by and listening to her wail and seeing her clothing and the ashes? What is she telling them? My sanctity is gone. My virginity is gone. What'd you say, Mary? I've been raped. She's not using the words, right? But she is letting people know what has happened to her. She has been violated. The virgin princess has been raped. She's showing despair, grief, sadness, hopelessness, and humiliation. Oh, if women who are raped could just do this. I remember a couple at the church I worked at called me. It was a mom and the man she lived with, and she wanted to talk to me about her daughter. Could I come as the pastor, sit with her, this boyfriend, and their 17-year-old daughter? Because the 17-year-old daughter had been raped. And so I did. I sat with this beautiful young girl, and they shared the story, and she shared the story, and she was stoic. And I remember saying to her, I am so sorry. And she said, oh, it's okay. And I was like, oh, no, this is not okay. If only we could be able to express ourselves the way Tamar did, right? The average woman who gets raped in America doesn't even let it out for 7 years. I've actually pastored women in their 40s, and I was the first person they've ever told. Pastors' wives and their husbands don't know. What do you think that does to a marriage? I was with a woman who's 67 years old. She came up to me. She said, I was raped at 18 by a police officer in a different city. I won't tell you where. And she said, and he told me if I ever tell, he'd kill my whole family. I'm 67 years old. Last year was the first time I ever told anyone I was raped at 18. Only we could immediately express ourselves the way Tamar expressed herself. Her brother Absalom asks her, have you been violated? And then he takes her into the home. And then he says to her, I need you to be silent about what's happened. And I think this is the second rape that happens to Tamar. So he brings her in. He now acknowledges what happened, and then he silences her. I've had this reported to me many times as a pastor, too, where women have come forth to tell their families after agonizing it for years and years and years, only to be told by their parents, silence. We're not going to talk about this. So, I want to ask the question, and we don't have to actually answer it out loud because I think it's a pretty vulnerable question, but I think it's a question we need to ask ourselves. Have we ever had a person share with us, like throw out enough for us to like maybe catch on that they're trying to tell us? You know how the people throw out, what do they call those? Like little nuggets that they're just like, they're not telling you, they're crumbs, like, please ask me more, right? Like, and but you don't chase it. Have you ever had someone share with you that they've been victimized, and it may not necessarily be sexual abuse, but victimized? And if so, how did you handle it? Did you ask them to be silent? Did you push them away? Did you ignore? Or did you receive? I mean, it's very uncomfortable when someone who's been victimized comes to you. We're not always prepared to handle it, are we? But we need to ask the question here. When someone comes to me, how do I handle it when they've been victimized? How should I handle it? These are some of the things that the resources will help you uncover and learn. We won't share that out loud because I think it's a vulnerable thing. And I think probably there have been one or two of us in this room who've done the same thing as Absalom did. Silence. We're not going to talk about that. I know the church has done that on a whole. Silence. We're not going to talk about that. What happens to a woman when she's been violated and she's told to stay silent? Well, she's violated again, isn't she? She's victimized again, traumatized again. But this is a question I would like for us to think about. I would like for us to think about, and this is something I want you guys on Facebook Live, if you're with other women, discuss amongst you as we discuss it here. And if you don't have someone with, then just noodle down or throw up some suggestions here on Facebook Live, and we'll try to read them out. And if somebody's on your Facebook, you can tell me, because you know I'm not real good at reading them, but some of you need to be distracted and you want to Google at the same time and do all that stuff. So here's the question. I want you to think of a time when you were silent. And by the way, it might not be because of some kind of victimization, but think of a time when you were silenced. What was the situation, the circumstance? What were you prevented from saying? And how did that make you feel? Now, the reason I'm asking this question is because even if we haven't experienced exactly what Tamar has experienced, I think probably most of us in this room have been silenced at one time or another. I know I have. After Donald Trump was elected president, it wasn't about Donald Trump, I was very upset that the church ignored sexual exploitation in this man based on the fact that people were much more interested in the issue of abortion. And I wanted my brothers to care about everything that happens to my body, not just when it gets pregnant in the womb. I'll just say that now. I've lost some people and you're mad, and I'm sorry. You'll have to get over it. If we're going to care about the body, you better care about the body all the way. So I wrote an article, and I posted it. And I had a man in Houston call me. And actually, it was interesting. I had a woman from Houston call me. She had hired me to come and speak to her church at a retreat. And she said, my husband's here, and he'd like to talk. Well, she said, the women at our church are a little upset about your blog. I said, okay, we can talk about that. And then I called to talk about it, and she puts her husband on the phone. I'm thinking, does he go to the women's retreat? Because, all right, we're going to have this conversation. And he immediately let me know his power and status, where he graduated from seminary, what Greek he knew, what Greek professors he was friends with, who he hung out with in the Christian world. Names were a flying. Little Zeno, I don't know anybody's name, so it was like, okay, I'm sure those are important people. Um, and basically, he wanted me to recant what I wrote. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he literally kept pushing me on the phone, trying to strong arm me into being silent about this issue. Well, I didn't, and I lost the job, and so I didn't have the income, and so that's what happened. But I've had people try to silence me before, and I know you have too. So now I've had some time to think about it. Who would like to share? You don't have to give specific details because we don't want to throw people under the bus or gossip about people, but maybe just an incident. By the way, it could be when you were a little kid and a teacher might have silenced you. Yep, this is a light topic tonight. Anybody want to share? So the whole thing was silence. So what she said is growing up in a traditional conservative church, you weren't allowed to talk about any gender issues at all, and you weren't allowed to question whether what you were hearing about gender was correct. So it was just a silence about gender. You were going to take what was said, and we're not going to ask questions. No silence. This is the answer. Many of us have experienced that. How does that make us feel when we aren't allowed to ask, when we aren't allowed to use our voice? Makes me feel dumb. Makes me feel unwanted. Or it makes me feel bullied. Yep. It makes me feel like maybe what I have to say isn't as important as the other people who are being heard. Anybody else feel like that? What's another example that you've experienced where you were silenced? What was the circumstance, and even what was prevented from saying? What were you prevented from saying, and how did it make you feel? Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Think think about how unhumane that is. Okay, let me summarize. One of the women shared that her work, she works in healthcare industry, and that one of her colleagues committed suicide, and they were allowed to talk about it about a day, and then after that, it was silence. Like, we're not going to talk about this. We're not going to talk about mental illness. If you talk about it, you show vulnerability. We're not going to talk about the fact that there might be mental illness involved because that could cost you your job. Think about how inhumane that is, dehumanizing that is. A person has taken their life, it's traumatizing to those of us who can walk alongside them, but we're not allowed to deal with it. We're just going to stuff as if death, we can't talk about death. And suicide, right, particularly makes us unnerved. So, yeah. Mental illness makes us nervous. We're not going to talk about that either. Who else? One more story. Right. Sure. Yeah. Beautiful. We've all experienced that, haven't we? So what a woman shared was that she had traveled for 4 years abroad in missions, and when she came back, lots of people loved hearing about it. But every once in a while, she'd meet people in the grocery store, and they'd say, "Oh, I heard you went to Africa and those kids, and how was it?" And she'd respond back, and the lady would kind of drift off and start. She'd disengage with her body, basically. No, we're not going to talk about that. We've all experienced that, right? It's we, we were given, God actually spoke creation into being. Voice is crucial. It is a way in which we identify, which we know ourselves. We put words to things so we can understand things. So when we are silenced, it's dehumanizing, isn't it? It feels like we're being extinguished on some level. And that is not righteous, right? It's not the right way God wanted us to be able to relate to one another. I thought this was interesting. We're going to noodle this. I'm going to talk about it. I'm actually going to post it on Facebook after tonight, but this is an interesting concept I'm noodling around. I don't have it down. I'm not even sure what to do with it. But it's this idea about being a voice for the voiceless. You know, I've always said that. I've said it too many times. And then I was reading this guy. I don't even know where I got it from, but I'm sure it's one of the many books I'm reading. And he says this statement. It sounds good and noble, but we should pause before saying it. People are actually not voiceless. Everyone has a voice, and we don't need to speak for them. And here's what I've been pondering. Instead, we need to understand and address the processes that steal their voices or the reasons we aren't hearing them. Do you want me to say that again? Because that's really a profound statement, and I'm still noodling on that. We've all said that we need to be a voice for the voiceless, and I still think there's something true to that, right? But then I was challenged with this statement, and I think what it's challenging me to do is to not just assume I need to be the voice for the voiceless, but to go deeper and ask some questions about why that person or that people group is voiceless. This is what he said. It sounds good and noble, but we should pause before saying it. People are not voiceless. Everyone has a voice, and we don't need to speak for them. Instead, we need to understand and address the processes that steal their voices or the reasons we aren't hearing them. I'm going to put that on Facebook because that needs some noodling and discussion, but it's an interesting statement. We're going to get back to Tamar. Verse 21, we read that King David heard what happened, and he was very angry. Well, yet David get angry. And it's interesting in this verse, they choose the term King David instead of dad, right? Because he actually her dad, but the text doesn't call her dad or him dad, which we call on protection and care. That's right. A father is supposed to do this along with the brother. But actually, the author uses King David, the royal term, not the family term, letting us know that not only is David the father, but he's the king over the whole nation, which means he's got a whole lot of power and status and responsibility to obey the law, to bring justice to a situation, whether that's punishment, protection, or care. He's obligated, not just as father, but like highly obligated because he's the king, too. Have you ever been in a situation where you have been the vulnerable one and someone has been unrighteous towards you, and the person who should have enacted justice for you didn't? So when I was in Israel this past spring, um, some memories came up for me that I had forgotten about. And it was a really, really emotional time for me. Steve and I happened to be in the Jordan at Petra, which was freaking phenomenal, and you should go if you can. But there was a monument built there to the Pharaoh's daughter. And a plaque basically said that the Pharaoh would give up his daughter in marriage to any man who could figure out the water solution to Petra, which is in the desert. And I remember turning to Steve and saying, what if the dude that can solve the water problem is like a wife beater? Does that matter? What if he like plans on mutilating her? Does that matter? Like, there's no guarantee here that dad's passing over daughter to someone good. He's just solving a water problem. And I remember thinking, wow, how so important it was in her time frame that the person who had power and status over her not only um, be right by her, but be just to provide punishment when she's misused, but also care and protection. Because, man, if he doesn't, she's got no recourse, you know? So from that event, all of a sudden I started having a couple memories of growing up in my home. My dad was extremely abusive. Most of you know that. It's not new. But two memories in particular came about that just threw me. And I think in some tiny little way, this must be how Tamar was feeling about the fact that King David goes radio silent on her. I when I was a young girl, we owned property and we planted crops. And so I would go down to the fields and work in the fields all day, and it wasn't pretty. I mean, I really looked like Ruth. My hands were disgusting and matted. So if you ever see Ruth and Boaz, and Ruth is like jumping through the fields wearing a spring dress and some kind of shampoo commercial with her hair flowing, that's not an accurate picture of a woman who works in the fields. It's just not. The hands are disgusting. You're sweaty, gross. Your whole body is BO. It's not pretty. And we would take a break every like around 10, 11 o'clock in the afternoon or morning. We'd get up at 6 and get in the fields, disgusting. And we'd go across the street to this lady's house. I'm going to call her Paula. That's not her name. Paula is probably was like 10 years older than me. So she wasn't much older, maybe 15. Young, attractive, single woman. And my dad, my brother, all the workers, and my sister and I were the only women, girls, because we were girls at the time, walked across the street and actually would stand in the house. Everybody else would sit down and have coffee, and my sister and I would stand against the wall. And Paula would say ugly, humiliating things about my sister and I. Oh, don't they think they're just prima donnas, she'd say. And my dad laughed. Now, I wasn't feeling very prima donna with dirt in my fingernails and sweat and muck hair. And I remember distinctly being in Jordan, in Petra, and thinking, wow, my dad let a woman be abusive toward us, and he didn't not only protect us, he joined in. And then I remembered when I was in high school, my senior year, I dated this guy who was very large. He was a football player. He went on to play professional football. And I broke up with him. And when I broke up with him, I pulled, a couple of weeks went by, whatever. I pull up to a party. I don't know Jesus at this time, so everybody relax. I pull up to a party, and he's making out with some girl, which is fine because we're broken up and it's no big deal. And I pull up in my new car, which really wasn't a new car. It cost me $3,000, but I paid for it, and it was new to me. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody in here? Or did you get all new cars from your dads? Like, I didn't get one of those. Okay, so I pull up my new car, and my lights are shining on him making out with this chickie, and he sees me in my new car, and I've got friends in the car with me, and he walks up to the door, and he punches the window. Now, he is a big dude, and I'm a whopping 5 to 110 pounds. And I don't know what happened, but I got a little irate, and so I got out of the car. Stupid move, right? I get out of the car, and I start screaming at him. What the hell do you think of now? And he slams me into the car, slams the door against me, and breaks my leg. I go home that night, and I walk in the house, and of course, I've got a broken leg now, a little upset, and my father says, "What did you do to deserve him doing that to you? Tamar has been raped, and her brother has silenced her. And her father, who is also the king of the nation, he's angry, but he goes radio silent on his daughter. What do you think that does to daughters when their daddy goes radio silent? Or any other person, quite frankly, with status and power who is in a position to bring righteousness and justice to the situation. It's devastating. It's like being raped all over again, isn't it? So let me ask you this question. Why do you think, and this is where we're going to have some conversation, so those of you at home think it through. Why do you think he went radio silent? Why do you think he ignored the violence against his daughter? It brought up his own shame, as one woman said. Yes. So can somebody think of what that shame would have been? Bathsheba. Because even though we've heard the story told that Bathsheba was, out in the bathing in her tub, and he sees her, and she is brought to him as if, like, she choice could say no to the king. I mean, Bathsheba was raped, people. We now talk about it that way. We haven't when you've heard that story before. She is a woman. She cannot say no to a king. He's where he shouldn't be. She is exactly where she was supposed to be. They take a bath on the top of the roof. He's not where he's supposed to be. He violates her, calls her, he rapes Bathsheba. So it's possible. Can you see it? Like, I don't really want to talk about my son's situation because that might be one reason he doesn't acknowledge or address the violence done to Tamar. What else? Yes. Right. That's a beautiful question. So she said, David didn't ask, David is the one that sent Tamar to him. And the question that one of the women wants to know is, why didn't he ask more questions? Like, hey, so, like, why do you want her to cook the bread for you? Or he didn't do it. He didn't do any investigation of why he might be pushing for the sister, half sister. So maybe he feels guilty? Is that what you're thinking? Maybe he feels partially responsible? Yeah, possible. What other reasons might he not be responding? Right, right. So the family structure is one, and the culture structure, one of which, not that big a deal. Dad did it. Let me as a cousin how you can do it, right? Like it's somewhat kind of acceptable, right? If 50 shekels will compensate in a marriage. Culture, at some level, makes it feasible for it to happen. It's not that traumatic in that culture. Beautiful. Calls his kingship into question. If he can't control the house, how is he going to run the nation? That's exactly right. Oh my gosh, this could look bad on him, right? Even might even affect the reputation of his God if people knew this was happening in God's house, kingdom house, right? Have you heard that? One other reason that's still out there, who's preferred in the family? The sons are preferred, right? If we have to do business and one's done trauma to the other, we're going to let the woman take the brunt because sons are preferred. Later, if you read in the text, he's devastated that Amnon is killed. Like he mourns and pleads, and they're like, why weren't you gushing over that way over the violence done to the daughter, you know? So all of these reasons are at play. So now let's bring it to home. I had you read an article in your lesson about some men in the United States in the conservative evangelical world who have been accused of sexual exploitation, of abuse to women, right? Um, Powerful men, men with fabulous reputations. And church has been silent about it. Silent. In fact, I've been watching on social media when three men in particular fell this summer, three hugely powerful men fell this summer. I watched to see if any of my other conservative, powerful Christian brothers, male in the church leaders, respond like were saying anything, and it was pretty darn quiet. And then at the same time, the Catholic Church situation came out with priests molesting thousands and thousands of children. And suddenly, my brothers, who were very quiet about their own, you know, brothers that have fallen, had comments to make about the Catholic Church. And I thought, oh, no, 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 no. Right? We're going to talk about Catholicism and what happens in that faith tradition, but we're not going to address our Protestant brothers. So I wonder, why has the church been silent? Which, by the way, is why I'm lamenting on Thursday. I want to stomp my feet. I don't know if it's going to make any difference, but I'm going to feel better afterwards. Why has the church been silent? It makes who look bad? The church. It makes the church look bad, which then in what we've heard is then it makes God look bad. Let's talk about it outside the walls of the church because it will make God look bad. Yeah, so as one of the women here said, I think it might be accurate, there's potential here that some men aren't speaking up because they themselves have crossed a line when it comes to sexual exploitation. And so it's that same thing that David's like, I want to say that I wasn't doing much better, right? Right. These are right. Yeah. So there's a oh, what if these are accusations and then I'm proven wrong? So almost a preference for whose voice is getting listened to, kind of like what we see here in Amnon and Tamar. My God. You know, it says in Scripture, there's nothing new under the sun. Well, no, there is not. Any other reasons you think, maybe? Preference? Blame the victim, especially if the victim isn't preferred, right? We're back to that same. What I'm hoping you'll see is that, and yes, I have a rant. Get it? I'm passionate about this. I don't usually put my own personality into this fully, but I got to tell you, it's right here in Scripture. And I think what we see here in Scripture is very much what we're seeing today in the church. There's a lot of correlation. Okay, so let me wrap up a little bit here. Absalom emerges, and he eventually takes revenge and kills Amnon, right? And that even makes me think this is what happens when unrighteousness isn't brought to justice. We have, if you think about it, it wasn't his right to kill him. We have bloodshed now, murder happening as a byproduct because those in power with the ability to bring justice. It's a bit of a warning if you think about it. In verse 20, Tamar's story ends on a note I don't want it to end on. Like This is going to end great. She's going to end up married to the best man in the whole nation of Israel and have 12 sons and just do awesome. Run her own company, Jewish makeup. But no, verse 20. So Tamar dwelt, and she was desolate in the house of Absalom, her brother. And that's where her story ends. This tension of unresolvedness. Her God may be an eternal king, but her circumstances in her lifetime feel more like God is nowhere to be around. There is no neat little conclusions here to her life story, much like there aren't too many of our stories. There is, though, here a tiny glimmer of future hope and a deep warning, and that's what I'm going to end on. Lamentations, which is the book we're going to work through on Thursday, we're just going to have some readings out of it, is a book written so that we can cry out in pain and suffering. It happens in our lives and the world in which we live and move. And in this book, you're allowed to protest and process out loud, to share your confusion, but there's also like a hope. It's a future hope. This idea that if God is faithful in things that he's doing, sun up, sun down, he will be faithful in the end at some point. I'm counting on future hope. Lamentations 3:22-24 says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." You have this sense of future hope. I'm counting on you, God. Have you ever said that to him? You said you're faithful. Okay. I'll wait till I see you on the other side, but when I get there, I better see that's true. Have you ever I guess you're just not as relational with him as I am, because we have those conversations. Interesting, in chapter 14:27, Absalom gives a daughter the name Tamar. Now that should be a shameful, dishonored name by this point, but he doesn't see it that way. And it's almost like he's going from the aunt to the niece, saying, you will not steal her honor. She will not live unshamed. My daughter will carry on her name. This idea of reclaiming Tamar. Not enough for me, quite frankly, because Tamar lives in Absalom's house in desolation, unmarried, no son, the rest of her life. There is this glimmer of hope, but more so, there is a big, fat warning to the church. And here it is. In 2 Samuel, the first 10 chapters are about David's succession and the rise of the nation of Israel. Here we go. David's success, and the rise of the nation of Israel. First 10 chapters. The last 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, are David's failures and the decline of the nation of Israel. And in the middle of those 10 and 10, we have what they call a chiasm, which is this unique writing style in the Hebrew. To put it simply, what's in the middle is the point to the story. So we've got David's success, we've got David's failure. We've got the nation's success, we've got the nation's failure. And in the middle, we have the chiasm, which is God's point. And you know what's in the middle? There's the story of Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, and then there's the story of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. And in the middle of those two stories, we have the prophet Nathan, who rebukes King David and depicts his downfall. And so, church, I think we need to consider the chiasm of what God is saying to us at this time in history in the American church. 10 chapters of rising and success of the nation and the man, and 10 chapters of failure of the nation and the man. And the very middle is a rebuke, because the man and the nation ignored the violation of 2 women who were raped. I think our brothers in leadership, since I don't have the power and status over them, need to hear that warning. Don't you? So I want to end tonight with reading a liturgical prayer You've all got a paper in front of you. I don't know how to apply this. I don't even want to do application. So the application for me tonight, if you have an extra one, they need one back there or share. I want to, and she needs one here. I want to pray for violence done against women, not only against us, but women around the world. And so I'm going to read, and then you're going to read back. We cry out to you, bring justice. Do you see it? It's bolded. Okay. If you don't want to say it, if you don't want to read it, you don't have to, because you are grown women and you can make your own decision. So together, as the church, our application tonight is to cry out to the Lord. Hear us, Lord Jesus, when we cry to you for all the women and girls who are victims of violence. Hear us, Lord Jesus Christ, for they are stripped and beaten as you are stripped and beaten. They are humiliated and used as you were betrayed and shamed. For the beaten girls and the battered women, blamed and bruised by angry men, we cry out to you, bring justice. For the young girls given or sold in marriage, and for unwilling brides with no way out, we cry out to you, bring justice. For the women raped as a weapon of war, and for the children they bear in grief and shame. For the victims of rape who are killed or taken their own lives, and for the rape survivors who live with their scars. For the girls denied access to education, told they are stupid or worthless or expendable, we cry out to you, bring justice. For the girls and women sold and tricked into sex trade, and for sex workers exposed to disease and violence. For the mothers whose children are taken away by armies, governments, churches, or family members. For the girl children who are unwanted and rejected, the first to be aborted and abandoned, the last to be fed. For the women bashed in their own homes and their children who see and hear the violence. For the women trapped in destructive relationships, manipulated, controlled, justifying their abusers. The women who hid their bruises and lied about their injuries for fear of the next attack. For the women bullied in their workplaces, belittled, underpaid, threatened with losing their jobs. For the women in prison, abused and abusing, beset by poverty, mental illness, and addictions. For the women attacked by their sexual identity, targets for physical or sexual assault. For the women and girls denied religious freedom, forced to submit by custom or by law. For the older women, frail in body or mind, fearful of violence, manipulated or neglect. We cry out to you, Lord Jesus Christ, for our sisters, our daughters, our mothers, and for ourselves. Bring justice, bring healing, bring hope. Amen. Thank you, ladies, for enduring this very difficult topic. You can stay, drink wine, talk further, or you can go home. We'll see you next week here Monday night.